think tariffs are actually, we've had a lot of experience with them. They're an act of war to some degree.
How do you think tariffs will impact inflation?
Over time, they're a tax on goods. I mean, the tooth fairy doesn't pay them. I mean,
Can I just ask you a couple of questions about kind of how you see the state of the economy right now?
well, I think that's the most interesting subject in the world, but I can't talk about it now. I really can't.
How do you think tariffs will impact inflation?
Over time, they're a tax on goods. I mean, the tooth fairy doesn't pay them. I mean, and see, you always have to just, and then what? You always have to ask that question in economics. Always say, and then what?
So is there an answer for that when people say, inflation persists, consumer prices keep going up, when's the end in sight?
No, prices will be higher 10 years from now and 20 years from now and 30 years from now.
And what do you think about what's happening in Washington right now? About efforts to
I think
cut
it's
the-
Washington.
Yeah.
It's, technology changes things, all kinds of things, but Washington is Washington. And the problem with politics is that you tend to have to make tiny compromises as you go along. We had an enormous economic recovery, but the minds of people had been so scarred, the memories. Parents told their children, 1929 became a symbol in people's minds. I mean, if you said 1929, it was like saying 1776 or 1492. I mean, everybody knew exactly what you were talking about. In 1929, my dad, who was 26 years of age then, was employed as a securities salesman by a local small bank. And he sold stocks and bonds, but he sold stocks. And when stocks fall 48%, and you were selling them to people a few months ago, you really don't feel like going out and facing those same people. So I think my dad probably elected to do, as they say now, shelter in place, which means stay at home. And there really wasn't that much in our house. We just had a small yard. It was wintertime anyway. My dad wouldn't have been puttering on the yard anyway. And there really wasn't, television wasn't there. And he and my mother got along very well. So under those conditions, if you'll turn to the next slide, I was born about 9 months later. But at that time, I was actually born on the stock market had actually recovered over 20% during that 9.5 month period or thereabouts. People did not think in the fall of 1930, they did not think they were in a Great Depression. They thought it was a recession very much like had occurred at least a dozen times, although not always when stock markets were important. But we'd had many recessions in the United States over the time, and this did not look like it was something dramatically out of the ordinary. And for a while, actually for about 10 days after my birth, that view held on, and the stock market actually managed to go up all of 1 or 2% there in those 10 days. But that's the last day. From that point, if you'll turn to the next slide, the stock market went from a level of 240 to 41. Which was a noticeable decline, because if somebody had given me $1,000 on the day I was born and I'd bought stocks with it and bought the Dow average, my $1,000 would have become $170 in less than 2 years. And that is something that none of us here ever experienced. That we may have had it with one stock occasionally, but in terms of having a broad range of America marked down 83% in 2 years, and marked down 89% of the peak. It was in September 3rd, 1929. Was extraordinary. And he had 2 kids at that point, and his father had a grocery store, but Charlie and I both worked for my grandfather. Charlie worked there in 1940, I worked there in 1941, so we didn't know each other, but my grandfather said to my father that, don't worry about your groceries, Howard. He says, I'll just let your bill run. And one of the things as I look back on that period is, and I don't think economists generally like to give it that much of a point of importance, the sweeping legislation that took place when Roosevelt came in. But if we'd had the FDIC, we would have had a much, much different experience, I believe, in the Great Depression. They went on smooth holiday, and there's all kinds of things, and the margin requirements in 29, and all of those things entered into creating a recession. But if you have over 4,000 banks fail, that's 4,000 local experiences where people save and save and save and put their money away, and then someday they reach for it and it's gone. And that happens, in all 48 states, and it happens to your neighbors, and it happens to your relatives. It has to have an effect on the psyche that's incredible. So it would have been a somewhat different world, I'm sure, if the bank failures hadn't just rolled across this country, and with people that thought that they were savers found out that they had nothing when they went there, and there was a sign that said closed. So the Great Depression went on, and it lasted a very long time, but it lasted a lot longer in the minds of people than it did actually in its effects. World War II came along, and on sort of an involuntary manner, we adopted Keynesianism. We started running fiscal deficits, of course, that were absolutely huge, and took our debt up to a percentage of GDP, which had never reached before, and never reached since. So we had an enormous economic recovery, but the minds of people had been so scarred, the memories. Parents told their children, 1929 became a symbol in people's minds. I mean, if you said 1929, it was like saying 1776 or 1492. I mean, everybody knew exactly what you were talking about, and it affected stock prices in a rather remarkable way, to the point, if you'll change to the next slide, it was January 4th of 1951 that the kid who was born on August 30th in 1930 had finished college before the stock market got back to where it was at that earlier time. So take the years from 1930, or 1929, really, to 1951, or take the year from my birth, 20 years, and bear in mind that the country was only 140 years old when you started that. That's 20 years out of this amazing 231-year lifetime of our country that was flat out in a time for a long time of no economic growth and no feeling by people in terms about the wealth of the country, about what the American economy was worth, what all these corporations that were doing far, far, far better than they were long ago. But it took all of that time to restore in the market a price level that was equal to what it was when I was born 20 years earlier. So if you think about the fact that we're enduring a few months, and we'll endure many more months, and we don't know how it comes out, and people in the 30s didn't know how it was going to come out, but they endured, persevered, prospered, and the American miracle continued. But it's interesting in that I actually don't have a slide for the next one, because last night I was thinking, after all the slides had been prepared, I was actually thinking about this a little bit, and I remembered that at the start of 1954, the stock market the Dow was only at about 280, and I remember 1954 because it was the best year I ever had in the stock market. And the Dow went from essentially 280 or thereabouts at the start of the year to a little over 400 at the end of the year. And when it went to 400, as soon as when it crossed 381, that famous figure from 1929, when it went to 400, and this will be hard for some of you to believe, but everybody wondered, is this 1929 all over again? And that seems a little far-fetched, because it was a different country in 1954. But that was the common question, and it actually achieved such a level of worry about whether we were about to jump off another cliff, just because the 381 of 1929 had been exceeded, that they held Senator Bill Fulbright of Arkansas, who became very famous later in terms of the Foreign Relations Committee, but he headed the Senate Banking Committee, and he called a special investigation, and he called it the stock market study. But it really, if you read through it, he really was questioning whether we had built another house of cards again. And on his committee, interesting to see the Senate Finance Committee, one of the members was Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. And his committee, in March of 1955, with the Dow at 405, assembled 20 of the best minds in the United States to testify as to whether we were going crazy again, because the market was at 400, the Dow was at 400, and we'd gotten in this incredible trouble before. But that was the mindset of the country. It's incredible. We didn't really believe America was what it was. And my boss, the reason I'm familiar with this 1,000-page book that I have here, I found it last night in the library and everything, was that I was working in New York for one of the 20 people that was called down to testify before Senator Fulbright. And he testified right before Bill Martin, who was running the Federal Reserve, testified. And I remember, because Ben Graham was one of the three smartest people I've met in my life, and when he testified, the Dow at 404, he had one line in there right toward the start in his written testimony, and he said, the stock market is high, looks high, it is high, but it's not as high as it looks. But he said it is high. And since that time, if we'll turn to the next slide, of course, we felt the American tailwind at full force. You're looking at a market today that has produced $100 for every dollar. All you had to believe in America, just buy a cross-section of America. You didn't have to read the Wall Street Journal. You didn't have to look up the price of your stock. You didn't have to pay a lot of money in fees to anybody. You just had to believe that America was intact. But you'd had this testing period between 1929 and really, certainly 1954 is indicated by what happened when it got back up to 380. You had this testing period, and people really had lost faith to some degree. They just didn't see the potential of what America could do. And we found that nothing can stop America when you get right down to it. And it's been true all along. It may have been interrupted with the scariest of scenarios when you had a war with one group of states fighting another group of states. And it may have been tested again in the Great Depression, and it may be tested now to some degree. But in the end, the answer is never bet against America. We've seen steel costs increase somewhat, but as I said earlier, I don't think the United States or China, there'll be some jockeying back and forth, and there'll be something that leaves some people unhappy. But I don't think either country will dig themselves into something that precipitates and continues any kind of real trade war in this country. We've had that in the past a few times, and I think we've learned a general lesson on it. But there will be some things about our trade policies that irritate others, and there'll be some from others that irritate us, and there'll be some back and forth. But in the end, I don't think we'll come out with a terrible answer on it. Charlie, what's you?
Well, steel the conditions in steel were almost unbelievably adverse to the American steel industry. You know, even Donald Trump can be right on some of this stuff.
The thing about trade, I've always said that the president, whether it's any president, needs to be an educator in chief, which Roosevelt was in the Depression. That's why he had those fireside chats, and it was very important that he communicated to the people what needed to be done and how, and what was happening around them. And trade is particularly difficult because the benefits of trade are basically not visible. You know, you don't know what you would be paying for the clothes you're ordering today if we'd had a rule they all had to be manufactured in the United States, or you'd be paying for your television set or whatever it may be. No one thinks about the benefits day by day as they walk around buying things and carrying on their own business. The negatives, and there are negatives, are very apparent and very painful. If you're laid off, like happened in our shoe business in Maine, and you know you have been a very, very, very good worker, and you are proud of what you did, and maybe your parents did it before you, and all of a sudden you find out that American shoes manufactured in America are not competitive with shoes made outside the United States, You know, you can talk all you want to about Adam Smith or David Ricardo or something and explain the benefits of free trade and comparative advantage and all that sort of thing. That doesn't make any difference. And if you're 55 or 60 years old, to talk about retraining or something like that, you know, so what? It is tough in politics where you have a hidden benefit and a very visible cost to a certain percentage of your constituency. And you need to do two things under those circumstances if you have that situation. You know what's good for the country, so you have to be very good at explaining how it does really hurt in a real way somebody that works in a textile mill like we had in New Bedford, where you only spoke Portuguese, half our workers only spoke Portuguese, and suddenly they have no job, and they've been doing their job well for years. You've got to do two things. You have to understand that that's the price individuals pay for what's good for the collective good, and secondly, you got to take care of the people that where retraining is a joke because of their age or whatever it may be, and you've got to take care of the people that become the roadkill in something that is collectively good for us as a country. And that takes society acting through its representatives to develop the policies that will get us the right collective result and not kill too many people economically in the process. And you know, we've done that in various arenas over the years. The people in their productive years do help take care of the people that are too old and too young. Far from perfect now, but it has gotten better over time, and I believe that trade, properly explained and with policies that take care of the people that are roadkill, is good for our country.